I'm not really sure where to start with this. I don't know how to start videos, but I do know this. I fucking love Metroid II Return of Samus. Now, I haven't played Metroid 2 before doing this video. I've had it sitting in my 3DS library for quite some time, though for the purposes of recording I played it in an emulator with a SNES controller, and having just played it for the first time, I can't believe how much I adore this little masterpiece. This game has had a stigma attached to it for quite some time because, for the most part, it's only been known as a game in dire need of a remake, or that it simply isn't as good as the likes of the original Metroid for NES or Super Metroid. Don't get me wrong, I can certainly understand where people are coming from with this, but having just completed this game yesterday, at time of writing, this game has become one of my all-time favorite Game Boy games, and possibly my favorite 2D Metroid in the series. I've played the remake, for sure, and it's better on a technical level, but I won't go too much into that here. Like I said in the first video, I won't be comparing these games to those that came afterwards. I'll get to it at some point, but as it stands, I'm unable to record 3DS, so that could be anywhere from a year to the next half-century. So, you're probably wondering what kind of madness infected me to make me make such an outlandish claim in the wake of Samus's return and other 2D Metroids, and that's one thing: atmosphere. Atmosphere can mean a lot of things in games. It's not a term that's really easy to define, but to me, atmosphere or atmospheric games are a genre of their own, and even Metroid 1 was no stranger to the concept. I imagine a lot of you are wondering how a black and white Game Boy game can be atmospheric. Isn't the lack of color a hindrance in the game's ability to convey environments? And haven't I heard the soundtrack is a bit toss? And the answer to both is no. This is the same explanation I give when talking about why I view the N64 version of Majora's Mask as superior to the 3DS remake, and that's ambiguity. I'm sure some of you have heard it before in regards to horror games, and the same applies here. The more detailed and clean the visuals of your game get, the less scary or tense they become. It leaves less to the player's imagination when you spell it out for them with visuals. And this ambiguity with the visuals is what helps create that feeling of unease you experience when playing older horror titles. The less you tell the player, the more your mind fills in the gaps. In the case of Metroid 2's Return of Samus, this is combined with the claustrophobic screen of the Game Boy, and lends itself greatly to raising the tensions of this terrestrial dive into an unknown planet. Now, the visuals are slightly more detailed than that of the NES. The textures have a fair bit more effort put into them to make them more visually distinct from one another. However, they're never so detailed that you can fully grasp what you're looking at. They're just detailed enough so that they convey an idea to you. Be that, oh, that's a living thing, probably. Oh, that might be a plant, or these might have been the ruins of an ancient civilization, but I can't really make out what it was originally for, or what its purpose was. What really impresses me is how the deeper you go underground, they still manage to maintain visually distinct environments with different biomes and life forms. I'd have never expected such attention to detail from a Game Boy game, at least not pre-Game Boy Color. The deeper you travel into the planet, the more strange and alien it becomes, which is only enhanced by the game's soundtrack. As many of you have likely heard, this game's soundtrack doesn't really amount to much. That, apart from a few strong melodic tracks, the game is largely ambient beeps and boops. And, well, I agree. The boops ain't great. However, I think the point was to provide quiet time to build a sense of dread and anxiety, to keep you on your toes as you move further and further from the safety of the surface, so that when it bursts into the chaotic Metroid battle theme, it would be all the more potent. Much as I wish they had gone with ambient music over ambient sound effects for the caverns, I can't shake the feeling that the game's atmosphere would be worse for it. Ambient music, no matter how foreboding or atmospheric, does, at times, provide some comfort to the player in their loneliness. And if the game is taking the horror approach to atmosphere, then that makes the quiet time all the more important. That's why this game has a completely different feel from Metroid 1's strong melodic approach to world building. My only real complaint with the soundtrack is how the surface theme plays anywhere along the central column of the planet. Oh boy, I sure did get pretty far into this video without even touching on gameplay or story. I didn't mention it in the last video, but my reason for not mentioning the story in the previous video, or this one, is largely because they were confined to the guidebook, or in the case of Metroid 1, the guidebook and a poorly written attract mode screen. But I do want to talk about the story for Metroid 2, or at least what's conveyed from the title and in-game. When you start the game, you're placed right next to your ship, which can give you some context clues as to how you've gotten to where you are, and that you're most likely not some ordinary cavern explorer. This has much better conveyance right off the bat compared to Metroid 1, where you're just dropped into the middle of a cavern surrounded by enemies. It provides a bit more context to why you're here. The UI is also surprisingly clean for a Game Boy game, with all the important information you'll need being listed on the bottom of the screen. It has the obvious stuff, health, ammo, and this curious little number right here. I wonder what that could be, eh? I may or may not have given that away earlier, but bear with me. Upon entering the cavern, your first thought, if you didn't have prior knowledge, might be something along the lines of, why am I here? What exactly is my goal? And if you haven't played or finished Metroid 1, perhaps say, the fuck is a Metroid? Assuming you didn't just assume Samus was named Metroid. These questions are answered quite quickly. Not long into your spelunking expedition, you'll come across a creature emerging from something on the ground. You're not exactly sure what it is, but once you kill it, you notice the number at the bottom of the screen has changed in response to your achievement, letting you know you've done something right, though it doesn't let this sense of accomplishment come without a cost. With the creature's death, the ground shakes below your feet. It's not entirely clear what this means, but it does make you cautious. And bam! There you go! Your goal is now established, and your curiosity is piqued, and now you can be on your merry way. This is a bit of an addendum to the previous statement, I'm adding this in post, but the game also does a similar thing with demonstrating the evolution of Metroids as you travel through the planet. Your encounter with the first Metroid on the planet may give you the false implication that that might be the only form that they take, which, for the hardware, would be pretty understandable for most games. Now, the game could use the same indicator that you've killed a Metroid as the first one did, with the counter ticking down, and it does, but the game takes it a step further with the visual storytelling by actually showing the Metroids transform into their later forms, either by visible growth or direct shedding of the previous form as a shell or husk. It communicates clearly to the player that this is the same creature you fought before, but stronger. And unlike the initial encounter, it's immediately clear what you're up against. Additionally, the game does a great job at indicating when you're close to a Metroid, as their presence is usually preceded by husks of their previous forms, and this is particularly effective as the closer you get to eliminating all the Metroids, and the more frequent the later forms appear, the more husks you come across for individual Metroids. Seriously, the attention to detail with the environmental storytelling is astounding for the platform. I love how the save stations and power-ups are located almost exclusively in the ruins of the ancient civilization, how the number of enemies you encounter decrease the deeper you go into the cave system, and how what enemies you do come across in the deepest reaches of the planet are either heavily armored or hide away underground where they're less likely to be preyed upon by Metroids. Even more pronounced things like the lone Metroid egg at the end of the game that precedes the Metroid outbreak in the Queen's Nest. If I had one complaint regarding the story, it's the title of the game itself. Return of Samus doesn't really convey anything about the game's plot. At best, it lets you know what a Samus is. If you hadn't played the first game or read the guide, you'll still probably have no idea what a Metroid is. A more appropriate title for the game would have been something like Metroid Annihilation or Metroid Extermination. That could inform you what your goal is and what the creatures you're tasked with fighting are. And while I said I wouldn't do this, I gotta mention, it's just kinda odd that this is the only game in the 2D Metroid series that actually has a number in the title, as opposed to later entries where it's basically just a cliff note. Really, I could just end the analysis here and call it a day, but I'm sure you're all curious what I have to say about the gameplay and level design compared to the first game. Which, fair enough, I suppose I've been gushing about the game's environmental storytelling and atmosphere long enough. Let's get to it! Right off the bat, the gameplay is a huge step forward from the first. Now, the game is still a bit jank, but precise movement is a lot more dependable now. You can crouch to aim, you can aim down while falling, and Samus is a lot more versatile in her basic abilities, and it's fantastic. If I had to nitpick, and I do, I'd have to say my biggest issue with the movement is that Samus feels a touch too floaty at times, forcing you to correct your trajectory if you have any forward momentum when you start your jump. If precision platforming is involved, your best option is to jump vertically and adjust while you're airborne if you want more control over your movement. The boss fights can get a bit hectic, and the controls aren't built well for some of them, mostly the Zeta and Omega Metroid fights, and much as I think not fully feeling in control of the fight against unknown life forms could be taken as storytelling through gameplay, it seems more likely to me that this was just artificial difficulty. But thankfully, it's never unfair about it, so take that complaint with a grain of salt. Just like the gameplay, the level design is also excellent. It features the same labyrinthine level design as the first game, and it's a joy to explore. Since the game is broken down into chunks, it allows for more focused level design. Each area is open to free exploration, and it encourages you to look in every nook and cranny as you search for Metroids. I never felt discouraged in the search for power-ups thanks to the game's excellent visual design, which does a good job of drawing your attention to parts of a room that may seem suspect, as they're all well hinted at with context clues, like how the first room you obtain morph ball bombs in encourages you to bomb the floor with a visible opening below, and teaches you that this is a common trait of these rooms. So later in the game, when you find yourself entering these rooms from a different angle, you'll know your best bet for obtaining the power-ups is to bomb the floor and walls to open the way there, and if a route isn't clear enough, there's usually some indicator to encourage you to bomb it. The only moment I found obtuse in this game was a particular hall late in the game with these blocks that could seemingly only be moved with missiles, which had, up to that point, never been seen, and indeed were never seen again after this point. The key difference in design philosophy between Metroid 1 and 2's level design is that the enemy placement is no longer shit. The placement is actually meaningful. There's none of the unfair enemy ambushes of the first game, and the difficulty curve is much more steady. The enemy behavior is far less buggy as well. No clipping through walls or doors. And I also love how this game uses its enemies and boss placement to drive up tension. Health and ammo recharge stations are scarce, so you're encouraged to use your ammo sparingly to avoid backtracking and grinding, which, for those of you concerned, wasn't a major issue in the least. I can only recall one instance in which I felt it absolutely necessary for me to do so. This is a very survival horror approach to game design that is largely attributed to games that came out later in gaming history, like Resident Evil or Silent Hill. So, needless to say, I love this game. Downright adored it. Despite its moments of jank, my only thoughts walking away from it is how this game is looked back upon so poorly compared to other original Game Boy titles like Zelda, Link's Awakening, Pokemon, or Mario Land. How this game isn't looked back upon as a masterpiece of the Game Boy is beyond me. Perhaps it's a matter of expectations. Whereas Link's Awakening and Mario Land largely had a similar tone to the original console releases, this one distanced itself in both atmosphere and world design from the original in a way that the fans might have been taken aback from. Whatever the case may be, this is a damn fine game, and it deserves more love than it's got over the years. Definitely give this game a shot if you haven't already. It's fantastic, but it may not be for everyone. Whew, that ended up being longer than I thought it'd be when I started writing it. That said, I really do love this game. I hope I was able to bring something new to the table and that you found this video interesting, or at least entertaining. Especially in the wake of all the attention this game got following the release of the official remake. Well, with that said, I hope you all have a fantastic night and that the video lit a fire under you. Did that catchphrase do anything for you? No? Oh, okay. Join me next time when we take a look at everyone's favorite, Super Metroid. You can't see it, but I'm doing jazz hands. Bye!